The glass conservatory at Aldington Hall held the light of a May afternoon the way a jar holds water, contained, slightly false, warm past the point of comfort. Juno Marbury had delivered her commissioned folio to Lady Aldington not 20 minutes before, and she had not intended to stay. She had not been invited to stay, precisely. She had been kept, which was a different thing entirely, a distinction that Lady Aldington navigated with the practiced ease of a woman who had never needed to notice it. The cordial was poured before Juno could decline. The chair was indicated before she could excuse herself. And so she sat among the ferns and the orange trees in their terracotta pots, her leather satchel on her lap, the glass above her turning the afternoon into something golden and airless, while Lady Aldington's nephew, Lord Alaric Hartington, stood near the far window, looking very much like a man who had somewhere better to be, and his cousin Hugh Carstairs laughed at something only he had found funny. The conservatory smelled of forced roses and hot stone. Juno set her cordial glass on the small iron table beside her chair and let her hands rest flat on her satchel and waited, with the patience she had spent 15 years cultivating, for the moment she could leave. It was Hugh who started it. Hugh always started things. "Alaric," he said, in the tone of a man who enjoys the sound of his own observations, "you really must do something about this marriage problem of yours before the summer. The county is beginning to talk." Lord Hartington smiled, not at Hugh, but at the middle distance, the way a man smiles at a joke he has heard before and finds only mildly tiresome. "Is it?" he said. 3 seasons since Lady Aldington last hosted a dinner with eligible guests, and you have failed to find a single one worth a second dance." Hugh set down his glass and spread his hands. "I tell you, it cannot be so difficult. I could find 50 women in this county alone who would suit you perfectly well." And here was the moment that Juno would remember for the rest of the year, the moment she would return to in the cold studio on autumn mornings when the light came flat through the north window, and she was trying to recall exactly what had been said. Lord Hartington turned from the middle distance, and his eyes found her. Not deliberately, she thought later, but in the casual sweeping way of a man who has begun to speak before he has decided what to say. And he said, half laughing, as if she were part of the entertainment, as if she were a prop in the scene rather than a person sitting 3 feet away, "I can find 50 like you." He meant it for Hugh, or he meant it for the room. Juno was never entirely certain, but he said it looking at her, and the room went momentarily quiet, and Hugh laughed, and Lady Aldington found something requiring her attention on the table near the window. Juno did not move immediately. She sat for 2 full seconds, not from shock, but from the deliberate choice to be certain of what she was about to do. Then she set her cordial glass down on the iron table with the same precision she used when setting down a brush on a finished study. No sound, no drama, simply placed. She stood. She crossed the conservatory, 12 feet of flagstone and potted fern, and she stopped in front of Lord Hartington, close enough that he would have to look at her directly. And she did not raise her voice, and she did not perform. She met his eyes, and she said, in the same register she used to correct a pupil's Latin, "None will be me." 5 words. She did not wait for his face to change. She turned, crossed to the garden doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the actual afternoon, the real one, with a proper wind and the smell of cut grass. And she walked down the stone steps to the gravel path where the footman was trimming the box hedge near the gate. "Would you send word to my uncle's house?" she said to the footman. "I require the cart." "Yes, Miss Marbury." She stood on the path and looked at the kitchen garden wall and breathed the honest outdoor air and did not look back at the glass behind her. Inside the conservatory, Lord Alaric Hartington stood holding his glass where she had left him. He had not moved. Hugh said something. Juno did not hear it, and Lady Aldington said something in response, and the conservatory resumed its ordinary sounds. But Alaric did not speak again for the remainder of the visit. He stood at the window after the garden doors closed and looked at the gravel path. And when his aunt touched his arm to direct his attention to the folio Juno had delivered, 12 pages of botanical studies, meticulous and precise, the finest work the hall had commissioned in a decade. He looked at the pages without seeing them. He was aware of having stopped breathing at some point between her 5 words and the closing of the garden doors. He was not certain when he had started again. He looked at the folio. At the bottom right corner of the first plate, in a hand so small and exact it might have been engraved rather than drawn. J.M. He looked at the initials. He did not know why they snagged his attention. He closed the folio and set it on the table and went to find his hat. And Hugh made a joke on the way to the carriages, and Alaric heard it from a great distance, as if through water. That evening he sat in his study at Aldington Hall and stared at the 3 watercolors his mother had left him. They hung between the bookshelves in the afternoon light. Or they would have, if it had still been afternoon. In the lamplight, they were muted and still. He had loved them for 4 years. He had shown them to guests. He had told people, when asked, that they were gifts from his mother, which was true, and that the artist was a local figure, which was all he knew. He had never asked more than that. He looked at the lower right corner of the nearest frame. The initials were too small to read from where he sat. He did not get up to look. He did not sleep well. He was not sure why. 3 days later, at breakfast, Hugh pushed back from the table with the satisfied air of a man delivering a verdict that had been long overdue. "Good riddance," Hugh said, folding his newspaper. "That sort always overcharges. A vicar's daughter with Q pretensions? You are better off without the commission entirely." Alaric was looking at the window. The morning was gray, a fine drizzle moving across the kitchen garden. He heard Hugh's voice land in the room, and he heard beneath it an echo, not an echo, a recognition. He heard his cousin's voice, and then, without choosing to, he heard his own voice from Wednesday afternoon in the conservatory, and he understood that they were the same voice. Not similar. The same. The same rhythm. The same register. The same assumption that the woman in the room was furniture rather than a person who could hear. He said nothing to Hugh. He set down his cup, folded his napkin, and left the breakfast room. That afternoon he went to his study. He sat at the desk for a long time without doing anything. Then he opened the bottom drawer, the one he had not opened in 7 years, and he removed the letter his mother had left him. The envelope was still sealed. He'd never been able to open it, not in the weeks after her death, not in the months that followed, not in the years since. He had told himself it was grief. He was beginning to suspect it was something else. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet in his mother's hand. Small, precise, slightly slanted to the right, the way it always was. 1 sentence. Find people who do not need you and learn from them. He sat with the letter for a long time. Outside the window, the drizzle had become rain, and the kitchen garden wall was dark with it. He folded the letter and held it, and looked at the 3 watercolors on the wall between the bookshelves. The light was wrong for them today, too gray, too flat. They needed the afternoon sun to be fully themselves. He looked at the initials in the corner of the nearest frame. J.M. He looked at them for a while. Then he looked away, and the connection did not come. And he put the letter in his breast pocket and did not sleep that night either, lying in the dark and listening to the rain and turning his mother's sentence over in his mind until it was worn smooth. In June, Alaric stopped accepting Hugh's invitations. He offered no explanation. Hugh sent 3 notes over the course of the month, each with a different excuse attached. A dinner at the Carstairs house, a card evening, a day's shooting on the neighboring estate. And Alaric declined each one with a brief and courteous reply that gave Hugh nothing to work with. He began attending his mother's parish at Aldington on Sunday mornings. He had not attended regularly since her death. The new rector, a young man named Forsyth, who had replaced Juno's father 6 years ago, was competent and unassuming, and did not remark on the Marquis's renewed presence. The congregation remarked on it privately, with the quiet industry that small parishes bring to anything that deviates from pattern. Juno was not at the morning service. He did not look for her. He sat in the family pew and listened to the service and looked at the east window. Plain glass, not colored, letting in whatever the morning had to offer. And thought about his mother's sentence. In September, the weather broke early. A rain shower came across the valley on a Tuesday morning, the kind that arrives without announcement and turns the lanes to mud within 20 minutes. Alaric was walking the path from the church gate to the dowager's grave. He had formed the habit of visiting it on weekday mornings when the churchyard was empty. When he stopped at the lich gate and saw that the churchyard was not, in fact, empty, Juno Marbury was kneeling at the far corner of the churchyard, near the low wall where the Dowager Marchioness was buried, tending a cluster of small wildflowers that grew in a low border along the stone. She had a trowel and a small canvas bag, and she was working with the focused quiet of a person who has been doing this task for a long time and requires no audience for it. She had not heard him come through the gate. He stood and watched her for a moment, not intrusively, simply the way a person pauses when they encounter something unexpected. The rain was beginning in earnest now, small drops darkening the shoulders of her gray coat. She did not look up. He walked across the wet grass. He did not speak. He removed his coat, a good wool coat, double-breasted, entirely unsuitable for use as a garden cover, and he laid it over the low churchyard wall between them, where she could reach it without him needing to hand it to her directly. And then he walked on to the east corner of the churchyard and stood with his back to her and looked at the far wall and let the rain fall on his shoulders. He heard her work for another quarter hour, the small sounds of trowel on soil, the rustle of the canvas bag. He did not turn around. When the sound stopped, he waited, and then he heard her footsteps on the wet grass moving toward the church porch. And he heard the creak of the porch door, and then the churchyard was quiet again, except for the rain. He did not know, could not know, that she had planted those flowers herself 4 years ago, the spring after the Dowager's death. Because she had loved the Dowager Marchioness, and because someone ought to have done it, and no one had. He did not know that she came every few weeks to tend them. He did not know that the Dowager had bought 3 botanical watercolors directly from the Reverend Marbury's cottage 6 years ago, pressing 3 guineas into Juno's hands and telling her that her father was a good man and that she was a better artist than any 3 men the Royal Academy had produced in the last decade, and that she should stop signing her initials and start signing her name. Juno had thanked her and gone home and signed the next commission. He knew none of this. He stood in the rain and thought about his mother's sentence, and felt, for the first time in 7 years, that he was doing something she would not have found cause to correct. When he came back through the porch on his way out, He found his coat folded on the bench with the care of a person who folds things properly. Neither of them asked for its return. Meanwhile, Juno received the Linnean Society Commission in late August, a full folio of native British specimens for the Society's annual publication, the largest single commission of her career. She took on 2 additional pupils at the schoolroom above the haberdashery. A girl of 12 who could already identify 20 species by their Latin names, and a girl of 9 who drew with a natural instinct that made Juno's chest do something involuntary the first time she saw it. She signed the society contract, as she had signed every contract for 15 years. J.M. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday in July, 3 weeks before the Linnean Commission, slipped under the schoolroom door overnight with the landlord's name at the bottom, Hugh Carstairs. Juno read it twice. Standing at the schoolroom window, with the morning light coming through the dirty glass onto the 12 small desks she had arranged herself, and the botanical prints she had tacked to the plaster walls, and the shelf of specimen jars the girls had collected over 2 terms. She folded the notice and put it in her satchel, and finished the morning's lesson. In August, Hugh came in person. He arrived at 11 in the morning wearing his riding coat and an expression of deliberate pleasantness that Juno had seen before on men who had decided they were doing her a favor. He was carrying a letter. "Miss Marbury," he said, looking around the schoolroom with the air of a man assessing property. "I believe you received my notice in July." "I did," Juno said. "Then you'll understand I have an alternative to propose." He held out the letter. "Lord Hartington is willing to offer alternative arrangements for the school, considerably more comfortable ones." Juno took the letter. She read it once, carefully, from the salutation to the seal at the bottom. The seal was Alaric's, the Wycombe crest in red wax, unmistakable. The handwriting was not. She had seen Alaric's signature on the folio receipt from Lady Aldington's secretary, and whoever had written this letter had not been near that hand. The pressure was different. The letter forms were different. The spelling of arrangements was wrong in a way that Alaric Hartington, who had been educated at considerable expense, would not have been wrong. She looked up from the letter. "I don't know what game you are playing," she said, "but I am not a piece on your board." She returned the letter to Hugh unsigned. Hugh's pleasantness did not entirely leave his face, but it shifted, the way a mask shifts when the face beneath it changes expression. "Miss Marbury, I would consider carefully before refusing. Your Linnean work is not yet confirmed. Your reputation in certain quarters is fragile, and your aunt's pension from the parish trust has not been reviewed in some years." Juno looked at him for a moment. Then she pointed to the door. "Out," she said. He did not move immediately. "You are being remarkably—" "Mr. Carstairs," Juno said, in the same tone she used when a pupil had made the same error 3 times in a row. "You have threatened my work, my reputation, and my aunt's income in the space of 40 seconds. I have heard you. Now please leave my schoolroom." He left. She listened to his boots on the stairs, and then the door at the bottom, and then his horse on the lane. She stood at the window and watched him ride away. Then she sat down at the teacher's desk and thought about the letter. The forgery was not careful enough to have been planned well in advance, which meant Hugh had moved quickly, probably in response to something. Some change in Alaric's conduct that had alarmed him. The conservatory in May had been theater, she understood now, not a spontaneous moment. Hugh had set that scene and Alaric had performed his line without knowing he was performing. Whether Alaric knew about the eviction she could not determine from the forgery alone, but the clumsiness of it, the wrong handwriting, the misspelled word, suggested a man acting without his principal's knowledge rather than with it. She did not write to Alaric. Writing to Alaric would make her the woman Hugh had implied she was. A woman maneuvering toward a marquess through a schoolroom crisis. She was not that woman. She went to the rector at the neighboring parish in Mersham that afternoon and explained the situation plainly. He offered the use of his vestry room at no charge until she found a permanent solution. She thanked him, went home, calculated 3 months of commission money, and paid the costs of the move herself. She and her Aunt Phoebe and 2 of the older girls carried the specimen jars and the botanical prints and the 12 small desks in 2 loads over the course of a Saturday. By Monday morning, the school was open in the vestry room, and the 12 girls were at their desks, and Juno was teaching the correct Linnaean classification of the Digitalis purpurea to a girl of 10 who had found a specimen in her mother's garden and wanted to know its name. She would not be rescued on terms not her own. In October, Alaric's housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, mentioned in passing, while discussing the parish chapel restoration that Alaric had recently begun to consider, that the botanical artist who had visited the parish regularly some years ago had gone by J.M. and had been the Reverend Marbury's daughter. She mentioned this in the way that housekeepers mention things they assume are already known. Alaric stopped walking. "The Reverend Marbury's daughter," he said. "Yes, my lord. Miss Juno Marbury. She still lives in the cottage on the East Lane. Does commissions for London societies, I believe." Alaric walked to his study. He crossed to the 3 watercolors between the bookshelves, and he stood in front of them, and he read the initials in the lower right corner of each. J.M., J.M., J.M. He had owned these paintings for 4 years. He had praised them to guests. He had told people they were gifts from his mother. He sat down in the chair by the desk, and he sat there for a long time. Then he got out his writing paper and wrote a formal letter to Miss Juno Marbury of Aldington, requesting permission to commission a new botanical study for his mother's chapel at the parish church. He wrote it 3 times before the language was right. Not too warm, not too formal, with no reference to May and no reference to the watercolors and no explanation of why he was writing now. Simply a commission request, properly worded, with his full title and address. He sent it with his secretary. She accepted in writing. The reply was brief, professional, and entirely correct. He came to the cottage on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when the garden was past its season but still holding a few late asters against the stone wall. Juno's Aunt Phoebe received him in the sitting room with the wariness of a woman who had heard about the conservatory and had formed her own views. Juno came in from the studio with a smudge of Prussian blue on her left wrist that she had not noticed and did not mention. And they discussed the commission in the sitting room for 20 minutes with Phoebe present and the door open. Afterward, Juno walked him through her aunt's small garden to the gate, because the path to the lane ran through it. The garden was laid in old, irregular flagstones, some of them lifted by the root of an apple tree that had grown too large for the space. He was looking at the commission notes in his hand, and he stepped on the lifted edge of a stone, and his boot went sideways, and he stumbled, not badly, not a fall, simply a stumble. And Juno's hand caught his elbow before either of them had thought about it. 2 seconds. Her hand on his sleeve, his balance recovered, the garden going on around them. Neither of them commented. Neither moved away faster than the situation required. He walked through the gate. She stood at the apple tree and watched him go. The smudge of Prussian blue was still on her wrist. She looked at it for a moment after he had gone, then went back inside. That same week, going through the estate accounts with his solicitor during a routine quarterly review, Alaric found the July eviction notice. It was in a folder of Aldington properties under Hugh's management, or what had been Hugh's management, a courtesy arrangement that Alaric now saw had been considerably less supervised than it should have been. He read the notice. He read the correspondence attached to it. He sent for Hugh. The conversation in the Aldington Hall library was brief and cold. Alaric did not raise his voice. He had spent 7 years learning his father's voice, which was loud and certain and accustomed to filling rooms. He found, when he put it down, that his own voice was quieter and considerably more final. Hugh left the library. He left Aldington Hall. He left all 4 houses by the end of the week by instruction. Alaric's solicitor prepared the amended will that same month. The presumptive heir provision was removed. Alaric directed his solicitor to locate the schoolroom's current situation. He had heard from Mrs. Greer that the school had moved, though not why, and to restore the original lease anonymously, with 3 years paid in advance. He did not write to Juno about any of it. It was not a gift that required acknowledgement. It was a correction that should not have been necessary. In November, Alaric sold the London townhouse. It was his father's acquisition, a large, expensive house in a fashionable street that had been used primarily by Hugh over the last 4 years while Alaric was at the country estates. He had no particular attachment to it. He directed the proceeds through his solicitor to 4 educational trusts in counties where he held no land: a girls' school in Derbyshire, a lending library in Shropshire, a parish school endowment in Durham, and a fund for the training of women teachers in Somerset. He did not announce this. The solicitor handled the transfers quietly. The county noticed the house's sale anyway, because the county notices everything, and began to murmur about Lord Hartington's changed economy. Various explanations were proposed at various dinner tables. None of them were correct. He began working with the parish rector on the chapel restoration in his mother's name. The work was straightforward: new glazing for the east window, restoration of the memorial stonework, proper mounting hardware for 3 watercolors that would hang beside the Dowager's memorial. His solicitor wrote to the Linnean Society about loan terms for the pieces. The society replied promptly and helpfully. The rector was pleased. The dedication was set for Christmas Eve. In early December, Phoebe Marbury fell ill with pneumonia. Alaric arrived at the cottage on an entirely unrelated errand. He had borrowed months ago a botanical text from the Reverend Marbury's library that Juno had lent him through the rector, and he was returning it in person because sending it by cart felt inadequate. He knocked at the door and found Juno in the hallway with her coat on and her face carrying the particular expression of a person managing several urgent problems simultaneously. "My aunt," she said, by way of explanation. "The doctor is at Brabourne. There is snow on the Mersham Road." Alaric looked at the snow coming down beyond the open door. He handed her the botanical text. Then he went back to the stable, saddled his horse himself because the groom had already gone home, and rode to Brabourne through 4 hours of worsening weather. He came back with the doctor at 2 in the morning. The doctor went upstairs. Alaric sat in the kitchen because there was nowhere else to sit, and because it was warm, and because going home through the snow at 2 in the morning was not a sensible proposition. He put more coal on the range. He sat in the wooden chair beside it and listened to the house. Near dawn he was asleep in the chair, his coat still on, his boots still muddy from the ride, his head tipped back against the wall. Juno came downstairs for tea. She filled the kettle and set it on the range and turned and found him there. The coal low again, the kitchen gray with early light, a man asleep in a chair with his coat on because he had ridden 4 hours in the snow and had nowhere better to be. She stood looking at him for a moment. She placed her hand on his shoulder gently and let it rest there. Not to wake him, simply to let it rest. And then she took her tea and went back upstairs. He never knew. He woke at 6 to an empty kitchen, the range warm and the coal built up, and a cup of tea on the table that had gone cold. He rode home in the early morning, with the snow turning to slush under the horse's feet and the sky coming pale over the valley. And he thought about his mother's sentence, and for the first time since he had read it, he thought he understood what it meant, not as instruction, but as description, as something she had already seen and was waiting for him to find. Hugh's last move came in January. He had been dismissed, disinherited, and removed from 4 houses, and he had gone to ground for 2 months. And then he came back to Aldington Village and began talking. The story he told was that the late Reverend Marbury had mishandled parish funds, that the schoolroom had been built on money taken from the parish accounts 20 years ago, and that Juneau's school was, in effect, built on stolen money. He told this story at the inn and at the market, and to 2 families with daughters at the school. And within a week, 2 girls were withdrawn. Juneau heard about it on a Tuesday morning when the mother of one of the withdrawn girls came to the vestry room in person, awkward and apologetic, to collect her daughter's things. The woman would not meet Juneau's eyes. Juneau thanked her for coming. She closed the vestry room door. She sat at the teacher's desk for exactly 5 minutes. Then she got out her writing paper. She wrote to the Bishop of Canterbury with a request for access to the diocesan accounts from her father's incumbency. She wrote to her father's former curate, now at a parish in Sussex, asking him to provide a written account of the Reverend's financial management. She wrote to 3 families who had known her father well. Families who had received charity from him, who had seen his accounts, who had sat in the vestry with him on quarter days and watched him record every penny in his own hand. Over 3 weeks, she assembled the complete record. The diocesan accounts were clean. The curate's letter was detailed and unambiguous. The 3 families wrote letters that were, in their different ways, the most precise refutations of character assassination Juneau had ever read, because they came from people who had watched the Reverend Marbury refuse to take a shilling from the parish accounts for his own household expenses, even in the year his wife died, and the medical bills had nearly broken them. She presented the full record at the parish vestry meeting on a Thursday evening in late January, with the rector present and 6 of the 12 girls' fathers in attendance, and the bishop's written endorsement read aloud by the rector before Juneau said a single word. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She named every account, every date, every sum, with the exactitude she brought to Linnaean classification. When she finished, there was a silence, and then one of the fathers said that Hugh Carstairs was a liar and a coward and ought to be ashamed to set foot in the county. And 3 other men said versions of the same thing, and the vestry meeting concluded. Hugh left Aldington the following week. He did not return. Alaric heard about the rumor 10 days after Juneau had crushed it, from the rector, who mentioned it in passing while discussing the chapel dedication arrangements. Alaric sat with this information for a long time. He thought about the schoolroom eviction in July, and the forged letter in August, and the rumor in January. And he thought about the conservatory in May. And he understood fully, without equivocation, what kind of woman his 5 words in May had been addressed to. Not a woman who needed him, not a woman who could be managed or maneuvered or rescued. A woman who had been doing the work, all the work, entirely alone, for longer than he had been paying attention. He did not write to her. He did not visit. He waited, and he used the wait to finish what he had been preparing since October. Christmas Eve came with frost and candlelight, and the full county of Aldington in the restored parish chapel. Their breath visible in the cold air, the new glazing in the east window letting in the last of the December dusk. Juneau sat in a pew near the back, as a guest of the rector, in her best gray wool, with her Aunt Phoebe beside her. Recovered, thin, and determined to be present. The chapel smelled of pine boughs and beeswax and cold stone. The 3 watercolors hung beside the Dowager Marchioness's memorial, covered with a cloth of dark green wool, visible to the congregation as a covered shape but not yet revealed. Juno had not been told what was under the cloth. The dedication service proceeded. The rector spoke about the Dowager, about her faith, about her gifts to the parish. The congregation sang. The candles burned. Juno looked at the covered frame and felt something uncertain move through her. Not dread exactly. More the feeling of standing at the edge of a thing she could not yet see the shape of. At the appointed moment in the service, Alaric rose from the family pew and walked to the chancel. He stood at the front of the chapel and looked at the congregation, and the chapel went very quiet. He said he had 3 things to tell them. He said, the 3 watercolors his late mother had loved, the ones the county had admired in his study for 4 years, had not been painted by an anonymous artist. They had been painted by Miss Juno Marbury of Aldington, whose father had christened most of the children now present in this chapel. He reached up and drew the cloth from the frame. The 3 watercolors hung in the candlelight beside the Dowager's memorial: the wild garlic, the early orchid, the winter aconite. And below each one, on a small brass plate, in letters the front rows could read and the back rows would hear about before morning: Juno Marbury, Aldington, painted for the Dowager Marchioness of Wycombe. He said he had learned the artist's identity only in October by accident from his housekeeper. He said the 7 months since had been spent understanding what kind of man does not know the name of an artist whose work he has loved for 4 years. He paused. His voice, which had been steady, did something on the next sentence that the chapel noticed. He said that man had been his father, speaking through him, and that his father had been dead for 7 years, and that it was past time. He said nothing else. He returned to his pew. The chapel was silent. A child near the front shifted on the pew and was hushed. The rector cleared his throat, found his place in the order of service, and continued. The congregation sang the final hymn with the particular energy of people who have something considerable to discuss on the walk home. In the chapel porch, as the last candles were being extinguished and the congregation filed out into the frost, Juno found Alaric standing near the door. She had not planned to find him. She had simply not left when she should have. And now here they were in the stone porch with the cold coming in under the door and the last candle guttering on its spike. She looked at him. He looked at her. That was not an apology, she said. No, he said. An apology asks for something. I am not asking. She studied him in the unsteady light. She thought about the coat on the churchyard wall in September. She thought about the 4-hour ride through the snow. She thought about the brass plates with her name on them, her full name, her father's parish, the county that had watched her sign J.M. for 15 years. Come tomorrow, she said. Bring nothing. He looked at her for a moment, not surprised, simply taking it in, the way a man receives news he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He nodded once. She walked out into the frost. He stayed in the porch a moment longer, listening to the departing congregation, and then he extinguished the last candle himself. On Christmas morning, Alaric came to the cottage studio as instructed, bringing nothing, no flowers, no letter, no prepared speech. He knocked at the studio door, which was separate from the house, its own small room at the end of the garden, with a north-facing window that let in the flat winter light. Juno opened the door herself. She was at her easel. A study of winter aconite, half finished, the yellow flowers sharp against the white ground of the paper. She went back to the easel when he came in and stood before it with her brush in her hand. facing the window, and she did not look at him. "I have signed my work J.M. for 15 years, she said, because I did not want to argue with men about whether a woman could paint. Every commission I sent out as J.M. came back accepted. The ones I sent out in my full name in my first year came back with questions about my training, my teacher, whether my father had helped me. So I stopped putting my name on things." She touched the brush to the paper, added a line, stepped back. "Yesterday in the chapel," she said, "you ended 15 years of that arrangement without asking me." "I know," he said. "I am sorry I did not ask." She turned. She crossed the studio, 6 steps on the stone floor, and she kissed him once, deliberately, the way she signed a finished painting, with intention and without apology. Then she stepped back. "This changes nothing yet," she said, "but it changes the question." He looked at her. He did not reach for her. He simply looked, with the expression of a man who has stopped performing and has not yet learned what his own face does instead. "What is the question?" he asked. "Whether you are someone I trust with the things I have built," she said. "The school, the work, my aunt's house, my name on my own paintings. Those are not small things, and I do not give them to someone because they rode 4 hours in the snow." "I know that," he said. "Then come back Tuesday," she said. "We will talk about the Linnean Commission. I want your opinion on the mounting hardware for the Society exhibition. You have apparently given the matter some thought." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile without Hugh in the room, and it was a different thing entirely. Quieter, less performed, belonging to a different face than the one in the conservatory. "Tuesday," he said. He went home through the frost. Juno stood at the north window and watched the lane for a moment after he had gone, and then she went back to the winter aconite. Through January and February, he came when she invited him. Every visit was by her decision, announced in advance, and he arrived on time and left when the afternoon ended and did not press for more than what was offered. They talked plainly about the estate accounts, about which of the 4 educational trusts needed the most immediate attention, about the Linnean Society's specifications for the spring exhibition. They talked about his mother once at length, about the dowager's particular intelligence and her particular patience and the letter she had left him. And Juno told him about the flowers on the grave and the 3 guineas and what the dowager had said about signing her name. And Alaric sat with this information with the expression of a man receiving a debt he had not known existed and could not repay. They talked about Hugh once, briefly, and never again. The Linnean Society wrote in February to confirm Juno's solo spring exhibition in London. She read the letter at the kitchen table with her Aunt Phoebe across from her, and Phoebe said, "Well then," in the tone she used for things that had been a long time coming. On a late February evening, the fire low in the studio grate and the frost coming down hard outside, Alaric looked at the clock and looked at the window and said, "The road to Aldington Hall will be ice by midnight. May I stay rather than ride?" Juno looked at him across the studio. The north window was dark. The winter aconite study was finished, signed, and drying on the rack. On the easel was a new study, barely begun, the first spring crocus, pale purple against gray paper. She considered him for a moment. "Yes," she said. She showed him the spare room off the kitchen where the extra blankets were kept. She said good night. He said good night. The cottage was quiet. In the morning, gray February light came through the north window onto the work table, where the Linnean Society's letter lay open beside the ledger of spring exhibition preparations. On the easel, the crocus study had 2 new lines added to it. She had been up before him. And at the bottom right corner, in the hand that had signed 15 years of work with 2 letters, the signature read, Juno Marbury, Aldington, February. In April, the Linnean Society's spring exhibition opened in London. A wall of botanical studies hung beneath a brass plate. Miss Juno Marbury, Botanical Illustrations, 1810 to 1826. The studies were arranged chronologically, beginning with the early commissions from her father's parish and moving through the Kew folios and the private collections and the Aldington work. And at the center of the wall hung 3 pieces on loan from Aldington Hall: the wild garlic, the early orchid, the winter aconite, with a small printed note beside them. The artist's authorship, long signed only J.M., is here acknowledged in full for the first time. Juno stood in front of her own wall in the morning before the exhibition opened to the public, when the gallery was still quiet. She was alone for a moment. The Linnean Society's secretary was at the far end of the room with a catalogue, and the other exhibitors had not yet arrived. She stood and looked at 15 years of work under her own name, and she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, but a quiet recognition. The way you recognize a place you have been many times, but never quite been able to describe to someone else. She heard him come in. She did not turn immediately. She heard his footsteps on the gallery floor. She knew his footsteps by now, the particular weight of them. Stop at the far end of the room. She turned. He was standing across the gallery, not approaching, simply there. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has finally learned the name of, and knows it, and will not forget it again. She looked back at him. He waited. She crossed the gallery.